let me ask you this question. You ready for a question? Ready for a question? You ready for a question? You guys in the chat ready for a question? Say yes. Say yes. You're ready for a question. All right.
Yes.
I'm going to throw this out there. Do you think it's okay for us to teach our children about slavery? Is it okay for us to teach our children about slavery? Yes or no?
I think so.
You think so? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me take it one step further. Do you think it's okay for us to teach our children that slavery was inhumane and that
yes.
Okay, and that people were routinely beaten, right? They were deprived of rights. They weren't fed well. They were put in chains and chained to boats and brought across the ocean to do intense labor and not be paid for it.
I think just like how Germany teaches their students about, the Holocaust and Hitler, we should learn the dirt of this country as well, for sure.
Okay, good. So we've got slavery. Okay, I think we all agree on that, right? We should teach our children about the inhumanity of slavery, right?
Yes.
We should teach our children. Also, I think, I'm going to throw this out there, should we teach our children about how the Founding Fathers had a debate over including removal of slavery in the Declaration of Independence? Should we teach them that John Adams tried to get it removed from the Declaration of Independence, wanted us to make sure that slavery didn't exist? He called it a stain. Benjamin Franklin stood up and said it was a stain on our country. This is no place for this. Should we teach our children that there was a fight about this?
Yes, and also the fact that pretty much putting Indians on reservations could also be considered slavery. They were putting them in a place they didn't want to be, so that is a form of slavery too, so yes.
Okay, and it might be uncomfortable, right, to have these conversations, right? It might be uncomfortable to look underneath the rug, right? It might be difficult to have these conversations. Let me ask you another question.
It might kind of shatter your American exceptionalism a little bit.
Right, it might make you uncomfortable about that American exceptionalism, right? What about, here's another question for you guys. I'll ask you guys in the chat. Should we teach our children that America's had a history of sexism, that it was built into our system? What do I mean by that? I mean, hey, women weren't allowed to vote. Women were not seen as basically human beings on the same level as white men in the United States of America. Can we teach our children about the systemic sexism in our country as well? Is that okay to teach? Can we teach our children that it wasn't until the 1900s that women were allowed to vote? Isn't that, how do we go almost over 100 years without being allowed to vote? You're not even the same as men. You can't vote. Should we also teach our children about that women, even to this day, are still not paid as well as men for the same job in the same position? What about that? Should we teach our children about that? Is that okay to teach? Might make us uncomfortable. Is it okay to teach our children about that? Possibly. I think it is. Well, unfortunately, there are a number of freaking morons right now and basically that whole little diatribe I just did there, that's basically critical race theory, right? That's really CRT. That's what the whole argument is right now about critical race theory. Should we be teaching our children about racism, systemic racism, slavery in the United States, sexism, things that make us uncomfortable? Like you brought up the Holocaust in Germany, right? They teach that in their schools there so that they never go through it again. They don't sweep it under the rug. They don't hide it. It's part of their curriculum. And that only happened, 70 years ago?
Well, and I don't think, all the stuff that I've seen on critical race theory, I don't think the argument from people against it is that they don't want that to be taught. It's just that some of these teachers are taking it too far and making white children feel bad for being white. You know what I mean? Like children should not be made to feel like they are, because I agree that this needs to be taught. All of this stuff needs to be taught because it is our American history. But you shouldn't have to shame children that are white, like it's completely their fault, because it's not. It's the people from the past's fault.
But here's the thing. No one's doing that. And by the way, these freaking morons don't even know what critical race theory is, which we'll get to in a second. Critical race theory is being critical about our history and looking at it and not standing there and saying that, America is always great. America, is it possible to actually teach our children about these issues and not have to sit there and believe for a minute that hey, you know, America's had a lot of problems, and America's not great. And there are a lot of things that America's done wrong throughout our history, and we should pay attention to those things, and we should call them out, and we should teach our children about these things. And now, here's what's happening in Tennessee. Tennessee is aiming to levy fines, starting at $1 million up to $5 million on school districts each time one of their teachers is found to have knowingly violated state restrictions on classroom discussions about systemic racism, white privilege, and sexism. So we can't talk about white privilege. Like, what is white privilege? Really? I've had a whole life of white privilege. I'll talk about it. You know, I'm able to drive at night and not be pulled over because of the color of my skin. Right? I mean, this is ridiculous. Let's pause for a moment to reconsider that this critical race theory backlash is taking place when, you know, we literally have, like, Trump is not even president anymore. Like, Betsy DeVos is no longer education secretary. This is happening under a Biden administration. She's not the one issuing guidance right now against teaching that slavery existed and also was really bad. Like, the way that they want to teach it is that, it wasn't so bad. Like, slavery, it was inconvenient. You know, and some slaves were treated well because they got to live in the house with the master. Like, okay, like Sally Hemings sleeping in Monticello with Thomas Jefferson. That's the one instance of where we can point to a slave as being treated somewhat well. She was still a slave. Like, hell. Oh, so it's all happening right now. It's all happening.
Have you read any of the critical race theory documentation and stuff?
I have. Yeah.
Like the parts about having black only societies and dividing societies up by color. Like, you agree with that stuff too?
No, I don't agree. The point, what I'm saying is that banning these teachers from trying to force a narrative, like that they're somehow trying to force a narrative about, that trying to explain or sort of, I guess you could say, whitewashing history, for lack of a better term. Like so if a teacher wants to get up there and talk about the injustices of slavery, and a student then complains that I learned about how bad slavery was and that our country and the founding fathers had slaves, that the White House was built by slaves, like, we can't talk about that stuff. That's inconvenient.
But I honestly, I don't feel like
not
that's
separating people by the color of their skin to say, like, we should have a black only society or a white only society. So what is critical race theory? Well, Vice went to a hearing on this to see if they could actually find people who knew what this was all about. And here's what, this is amazing. So all of these people at the school board meeting are in Collier County, standing up there in front of all of these school board folks, telling them why we shouldn't have, why teachers shouldn't talk about sexism in our country, why teachers shouldn't be allowed to talk about racism in our country, and to point out the inequalities in our country, like Native Americans, like you brought up. So here is this amazing video from Vice. Take a look at this.
Teaching of critical race theory, or CRT, to K through 12 students.
So what is this meeting about? It's about textbooks, books filled with Marxist, communist, racially divisive ideologies.
CRT is a decades-old academic idea centering the role of racism in cultural and political life. But in the current debate, its meaning is ill-defined.
This critical race theory urges intolerance of all human beings that have been created in the image of God.
I do not agree with teaching children how to feel about things. That is called indoctrination.
I'll be damned if I will allow a Marxist revolution to take place in this country, and we need to reject our children even being taught it.
The Department of Education, Corcoran personally has said that he has directed his staff to go out to all of the publishers and get this critical race theory and all of its tentacles out of the existing materials that have been approved.
Keith Flaw is the founding director of the Florida Citizens Alliance, a conservative group that crusades against curricula it deems insufficiently patriotic or excessively progressive.
What did you see in those two books that you looked at? What did you object to?
Critical race theory. What critical race theory boils down to is teaching kids to hate their friends, teaching them to focus on race.
So he's the leader of this movement. And he says the critical race theory teaches you to hate your friends.
But I mean, I can see where he's coming from if you read it, because a lot of the text in the documentation for critical race theory does talk about, that kind of thing. It's too, like, again, I 100% agree with the fact that this needs to be taught in schools about racism and all this other stuff. I 100% agree. But if you read the actual documentation in the critical race theory documents, that's what I'm talking about. Like it does talk about white people in a very negative way. And like, you just have to go through and read the lines that I'm talking about, where they want basically black communities set up so that it's like they're segregated again.
Well, exactly. Well, I mean, but
and I can understand that the documentation, the actual critical, Kimberly, I'm talking about the actual critical race theory. I'll try to look it up and get the lines
from 40 years ago. I know we're talking about the academic research from 40 years ago. That's where it started. Like, if you go back to those papers, yes. Among the things they argued in those original documents was, hey, black communities are specifically, black people are specifically less likely to be getting, basically will not get a mortgage. Like, we will not give mortgages to black people. That literally, like, out of that was born this idea that, like, if you're not going to give us mortgages, then maybe we set up our own neighborhoods that you will give us mortgages. Like, and also talking about how government officials literally drew red lines on, to show where the black neighborhoods, like, you cannot cross this line. Black person tries to move in this neighborhood. Like, it's in our system. Realtors at the time, it was in the National Association of Realtors. Like, if you cannot cross this red line, if you're black, you cannot have a house here. You cannot get a mortgage here. Should we not teach that to kids? Should we not, like, actually shine a light on that? According to this guy,
yes.
According to this guy, no.
Rather than focus on character.
So let's look at some of these examples from the K through 5 books that you were objecting to the other day.
What I did was go through the teacher's manuals that are used to teach these books. And what you find is that it builds the foundation for critical race theory, not on the 3 words of critical race theory, but it builds the foundation on culturally responsive training, equity versus equality, social justice. So those are all innocuous terms in many people's minds, but when you look at how the left is now using those to drive the whole perspective of critical race theory.
What is the sentence in here?
I'm not sure there is one.
There isn't.
The terms, see, that's where most.
No, I don't even mean the terms. I mean the concepts. What in the book conceptually do you object to that teachers will read this off?
Culturally responsive training is a whole notion in the book. Equity versus equality is a whole notion.
But that's in the book that the kids will read.
No, that's in the book the teachers are using as a guide to teach the kids.
Do you have the section where it says something about equity over equality? Is equity mentioned in the teacher's guide?
I don't recall. Equity, culturally responsive training is clearly identified.
What is culturally responsive training? What does that mean?
Culturally responsive training is a fancy term for multiculturalism, dividing people by ethnicity.
Where is this from?
This is from the homework our team did.
So that's your language, not the language of the textbook.
It's language we found in the literature. I don't know what you're looking for, Mike.
I don't see anything in here that says that they're teaching critical race theory.
This is all very subtle. We've said that from the beginning. Critical race theory is a very subtle ideology that permeates this.
Okay, so there we get to the heart of it, right? Which is essentially the critical race theory, the 40-year-old texts that, like, go into great detail about redlining and all of that. Like, it's like saying that you're teaching Marxism, like you're actually taking a book from Karl Marx and you're teaching that. Or you can talk about some of the things that were discussed in those original CRT writings back many years ago, right? So you can have discussions about the inequalities and social justice and what that means. And nowhere in these textbooks are they going into any sort of ripping people apart based on their skin color. As this guy points out, he can't even find it. In fact, the literature that they find actually comes from their website, not the textbooks that the teachers are actually using. And yet, if a teacher wants to say something that could be construed as insensitive by a parent, we can't. I mean, I've literally had, when I've gone on the air before, I've had people tell me, they're like, you just bash America because we had slavery. Oh, a lot of other countries had slavery, and why are you being so okay? Just because black people, they've always had ability to buy a house. What are you talking about? Like, you should get over yourself. Like, America's the greatest country in the world. Like, what are you doing? Why don't you move to Canada if you don't want to show how great America is? That's the argument. So we can't talk about these things. So I need to move if I want to. Like, what? Like, I'm not happy with the fact that we slaughtered Native Americans. Okay, I can't talk about that. Can't talk about putting Japanese people in internment camps during World War II. I mean, because they were living here. I mean, really? Okay. But they're going to levy fines starting at $1 million up to $5 million on school districts each time one of their teachers is found to have knowingly violated state restrictions. On classroom discussions about systemic racism, white privilege, and sexism. So, I also love, by the way, that they were holding that hearing in the Martin Luther King building. Oh, that was hilarious. That board meeting. He's a democratic socialist, by the way. It was Martin Luther King. Can't talk about that, I guess. Let me see what people are saying here. Molly Girl says, Clayton, you're on point. Crystal Lee says, I was able to sell my home only after I took my family photos down because, we're black. Yeah, didn't I do that story here on the show a couple months ago? That was one of the most disturbing stories. Like, a teacher should be able to have that kind of a discussion in a classroom. Hey, kids, here's something that's really troubling. The history of black people in America has been fraught with social injustice. It has been fraught with systemic racism. Here's an example how black people were literally redlined and not able to buy properties in certain neighborhoods because people wanted them out. Oh, and by the way, that continues today, students. Here's a story today where black families routinely are reporting that when they have photos of themselves up on the walls, that when they're trying to sell their home, that it's more difficult for them to sell their home. And they've literally hired people that their neighbors will come in and act as if they are the family that lives there. They'll put up family photos on the walls of white families and the house sells. Or they get way more for their asking price, the appraised value. This has been reported multiple times. We've done it here on the show. Is that not okay to talk about? It's happening. Or would you prefer to be like these people and just sweep it under the rug? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think too much is swept under the rugs. I mean, people are so scared to have conversations around things they deem uncomfortable. I always tell people, I have nothing to me is taboo. We should have no taboo subjects to talk about. We should be able to talk about everything. When I finally started in my personal relationships, like my girlfriends and stuff like that, completely being 100% honest and talking about anything, I've maintained friendships after we've broken up. I have better friendships out of it because I don't look at anything as something that we can't have a conversation about.
Yeah, exactly. Like, don't beat around the bush,
Right.
I mean, maybe that was the Philadelphia in me, but I'd much rather just come out and say it. And, instead of wasting so much time and heartache beating around the bush and not talking about it. That's what the show is about.
And sometimes it's really uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable sometimes to have to tell somebody, like I was with somebody for a long time. I'm just like, I just don't really have feelings anymore the way that I did. And just having the conversation and being open it stings a little bit at first, but it's like it's so much easier to heal because you can work through it rather than hiding it, lying, and then not saying anything. And then they find out that you're doing something behind their back. And it's like, you know what I mean? It's so much better if you can just have the conversations out in the open. And that's like with my kid. When my kid was, getting to that age, and I found out he was looking at porn on the computer, I went in and I said, here's a website you can go to that I know is safe. And here's some Kleenex. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just like, he's gonna do it, but it's like taboo. Everybody's like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. But it's like, we're kids, they're kids, they do it. So it's like just nothing being off the table and being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I've just found my life has been so much more, relaxed because I'm not wondering like, what somebody's thinking or whatever. Everybody always knows their place with me and I know my place with them.
Well, it's like the reason I love Seinfeld, one of the reasons I love Seinfeld so much was like watching Kramer, like here's a guy who was just like unafraid to say whatever was on his mind. And you're like, what? And it's like, that's why we love watching Curb Your Enthusiasm, right? It's like we wish we could all live like that, and I think we should aspire to that in many ways. And, without insulting and hurting other people, right? Like if you're not hurting other people,
yeah,
that's a different thing. Like, hey, like when he says, hey, you look beautiful, but you need to get your nose fixed. Like that. That's okay. That's
well, like I had to have a talk with my son one time because we're standing in a grocery line and there was an Amish guy in front of us, and my son was like, "Hey, you stink," which he did. But I was like, you gotta like pick your places to say things.
Yeah. Jeremy Kinlaw in our chat says, hey, just teach it correctly, but don't teach black kids that they came from slavery, like slavery is our roots. We came from greatness, and slavery was just a part of a bigger history where blacks came from. Yeah, great point, Jeremy. Like, people, unless you were born into slavery, unless your family line, like literally the reason you're in the United States today is because you were brought over, your ancestors were brought over on a slave ship, and the reason you're in the United States is because you were born from slavery in the United States. But you could also point out that, hey, no, we existed before slavery, right? Until the Spanish and the Portuguese and other imperialist nations swept in and chained us down and put us in boats and sold us around the world. We existed before the Spanish showed up, Yeah, a lot to talk about.
I would argue our prison system is modern day slavery. I mean, you've got, what's his name? The musician, really good. John Legend made a point one time. It really made me think because I had no idea, but there are more incarcerated black people today in prison than there were slaves during the times of slavery.
Oh, I bet 100%.
And that just like that puts into perspective, like how prisons are basically modern day slavery.
Right. Like, can you have a conversation about like why crack cocaine offenses like will net you this many years in prison, but cocaine, the white man's,
the
drug,
rich man's drug,
the Hollywood, Miami, or Miami Vice drug, like nets you way less time in prison. Oh, I wonder why. It's the same frickin' thing, right? It's the same thing. You can't have a conversation about that. You're going to get fined. And by the way, these school districts can't afford it anyway. I mean, you're going to get $1 million fines from the states if a parent says, I didn't like Billy learning about slavery. I didn't like Billy learning that, that our founding fathers had slaves. Yeah, they did. And they didn't release them even after they were even after they died, like Thomas Jefferson. Had fathered children with a slave and then didn't even release them after his death, like in his will. Can't talk about that though. Can't talk about that. We just need to go to Washington, D.C. and walk through the Jefferson Memorial and just listen to fancy music, dun, 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 feel like we're great Americans. But we can't talk about our dark past. Can't do it. Thanks for subscribing to the channel. You can also become a channel member by going to morninginvest.com/join, where you can stick it to the mainstream media and support independent journalism. We're able to bring you the stories that you won't see on any of the major billionaire-backed networks. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time, everyone.